Welcome. So today we're going to talk about what public administration is and what makes it different than private administration. So we started a long time ago that there were some political science scholars. Woodrow Wilson was one of those, and he said, you know what we do in government and how we do the work of government is not like the private organizations. It's founded in the rule of law. It's not really political. It's mostly just doing the work of politics. And so what is it? And so we're going to talk about that today and what makes it different. So the public bureaucracy is all of the public organizations. They exist in a formal, rational system of people who have authority to carry out public programs. In the last lecture, we talked about how citizens give power to representatives, representatives give power through the law to agencies, and the agencies delegate that power through some structures to individuals to do their job, and then they hold them accountable. Well, those structures, those are part of the bureaucracy. They're the public organizations that use a rational system of relationships, mostly delegated power and delegated authority and accountability, to do the work of government. Now, in public administration, we pay a very, very, very high priority on administrative responsibility. That's to say, we do the work with accountability to the elected officials and to the people who gave those elected officials the power. So once again, we as public employees always remember that our organizations are funded and paid for and authorized by representatives, and those representatives represent the people. In fact, what we do is here to just serve the public. So what makes public administration distinct? Well, it's not private. We know that, but we don't really have like a core set of theories or founding ideas behind what it is. Like in biology, maybe we know some major laws like evolution. In geology, we have theories about plate tectonics and erosion. Well, public administration is a little bit different. You might find a public administration school inside a business school. You might find a public administration department inside a political science department. It's not exactly administration like in the private sector. It's not really politics. What we do know is that compared to private administration, it focuses a lot on the role of the public authority. So in other words, we really care about where we get our source of power. And then what we've done is we've developed characteristic organizational processes that help us utilize that power, hire people appropriately, make sure that we're accountable to those powers and authorities that are given us, and then also equitably distribute the resources of government to those people who we serve. Now, in the public sector, we don't really have clients. Nobody buys our goods because they don't have any competition. It's not a free enterprise. You know, if you are in the private sector and you are making widgets or tools or toys, you might have a competitor show up every day. But here's the problem. At the Department of Motor Vehicles, if you go to find a competitor for the Department of Motor Vehicles like Johnny's Fake ID Shop, what they provide you is not anywhere equivalent to the power and authority that you are given in a driver's license to drive on the road. In fact, that's a violation of the law. So when the DMV talks about clients and people it serves, well, they're not customers because the citizens own the DMV. The DMV exists because there was a law passed by representatives, and representatives are accountable to the citizens. So public administration is different fundamentally than private administration. Now, one of the biggest things is that we often think about public administration as the execution of laws, but we also participate in formulation of laws. There's a key role for providing information to lawmakers on how to improve laws and what laws might be pertinent to help us do our jobs better. Overall, we focus a lot on administrative responsibility. Now, the number one feature that separates public organizations from private organizations is we call it the rule of law. Our relationship to the law is the fundamental difference between private and public organizations. Public organizations do what the law tells us we can do. We only do the things that the law enables us to do. We do not do anything that we cannot do according to the law. If the law doesn't give us power to do that, we can't do it. Now, private organizations can do whatever they want as long as they don't violate the law. As long as they don't break some law, they can do whatever they want. Now, what does that look like? Well, here, for example, if I were working at Google or some amazing, tons of money private organization, I could pay for lunches for everybody all the time. I could pay for the massages all the time. I could buy them housing. I could do whatever I wanted as long as I don't violate some law. I couldn't buy them, say, for example, cocaine or heroin because that would violate the law. But in a public organization, I can only spend money on the items that I've been authorized to spend money on. So in the state of California, I cannot buy alcohol on a meal. If I'm traveling, I can't buy alcohol on a meal. That's not authorized. I can only be reimbursed for a certain dollar amount every day that I'm traveling for per diem. I cannot, for example, spend money in California, spend money on state money on travel to a state that has a that's been banned by the state for state travel. Now, that sounds kind of silly, but it came from this the state essentially saying Oklahoma and some other states have gendered bathroom bans, and California wasn't going to spend state money on travel to those states. Well, now as a professor, if I want to go to a conference in a state that has one of those bathroom bans, it's prohibited by the state of California. So I can't even travel to a place because the state tells me I can't do that. Well, if I were at Google, I just travel wherever I wanted because it's not violating some law. A more specific example of that would be like the Federal Anti-Deficiency Act. That's the federal law that says if it's not authorized by law, you can't spend money on it. So those are just some examples. Now, Stephen Kelman talks about this slightly differently. Organizations have to balance goals and constraints, right? What we want to achieve with what we have. Now, private companies often focus on goals a lot more than public organizations because they're able to do all sorts of things. Now, public organizations also want to achieve a goal, but we really are curtailed in our efforts in some ways because we have so many constraints on how we can do things. Well, why is that? Well, because the law tells us what we can and can't do. Whereas in the private sector, you can do whatever you want as long as you don't violate a law. So that's the number one difference between private and public organizations. Now, how do we determine if an organization is successful? Well, that's also really difficult to figure out in the public sector. Well, how do you know if a police officer is doing their job well? Is it based on the number of tickets that they give? Maybe. Is it how they dress? That sounds weird, but okay. Number of complaints? What are they selling? Nothing. If you work at Nordstrom's and you sell a lot of clothes, you're a good employee, right? Sometimes even in private organizations, like car dealerships, they have really great salesmen who are horrible employees. And they're bringing in tons of money for the organization, for that car dealership. And they say, well, they're a good enough employee to keep them because, they might have a lot of complaints, but man, they can sell cars. Well, we can't do that for a police officer, right? So I think about police officers when they're pulled over. I think, well, now they can't police anywhere else except for that one person. And if I'm driving on the freeway, I am more scared about a police officer who is following behind me, and 50 other cars are too. They're so scared about that police officer, they're all going to slow down. But the one police officer who's pulled over to the side of the road with an individual giving them a ticket, they get to mark down, they got a ticket. Yay! Doesn't mean they're a good employee because now the traffic is going so fast because everybody in those other cars that aren't being pulled over are like, I'm not going to stop. I'm not going to slow down. That guy's busy. So, like, how do we tell if a police officer is doing a good job? Well, it's not as easy as how many tickets did they sell and how well are they dressed. Do they get along well with each other? We have to balance a whole bunch of different competing metrics. Speed and efficiency aren't always great in public service either. Like if we were reviewing case files for people who are filing discrimination lawsuits, I could pick up like 50 case files and stamp denied. That would be super efficient, right? Except that's probably not going to give it an equitable outcome or a fair outcome. Like I have to allocate time to do those sorts of things. I need to make sure that each one is processed efficiently, but also equitably, that everyone's getting their fair shake. We have to balance quality, high quality stuff with some output and some speed. We have to make sure that we're complying with procedures. We have to make sure that we're reducing waste. We have to make sure we're complying with oversight. We're accountable, that people are satisfied with our services. Now, I want you to think about this. We can often tell if an organization, a private company is doing well based on the number of people who recommend them to other people or the number of repeat customers. That doesn't work at the DMV. At the DMV, they have to come back. Well, that's not going to work. Well, what about their client satisfaction scores? So, like on a scale of 1 to 10, do you really like this private organization? Okay, cool. Like if you're comparing JetBlue to Southwest to Delta to United, that makes sense. There's some choice there. But I wouldn't ever ask whether or not the people in prison like their prison stay. Like on a scale of 1 to 10, how well did we serve you today? Or the justice system, like you just went to court. Now will you fill out this brief survey about whether or not you think the judge was fair to you? Like we just can't measure performance in the same way in the private sector as we do in the public sector as we do in the private sector. There's some other processes that we do inside public organizations that are really different than public organizations or than private organizations. Public and private are different. For example, in a public organization, we generally tend to think of people as career employees. So we get hired into some organization, you exist in that organization for some period of time, most of your career. And even if you're not in that one agency, you will probably skip around to different organizations inside government service. Now, if you're a private sector employee, we really don't plan on you serving an entire career at Walmart or at, a data analysis firm. You're going to sort of jump from place to place, maybe based on salary or job expectations or career growth. But really, you're going to be able to move around. So because we hire people for a career, we treat them differently. We treat them with long-term goals. We treat them with the idea that it's going to take some period of time for them to get hired and to maintain good performance scores until they can be permanent hires. And once they're permanent hires, we just assume they're going to stay until they choose to leave. It's hard to fire mediocre employees, we're going to talk about in the future, but we just sort of have to treat them differently because they generally have a lot of protections. Now, we already talked about measures of performance. We just can't measure them the same way. We have competing standards. We also suffer from a lot of public scrutiny that maybe the private sector doesn't suffer from. Well, duh, we have public power. Citizens gave us power. Citizens give us money to do that work. And we have high ethical standards and high accountability standards, and we have routine ways that the citizens oversee our job. Well, we're going to face a lot of public scrutiny. We have a lot of public trust, and they demand a lot of accountability. Talking about career service in one way, but also in other ways, we often have to persuade people. We persuade employees because we don't have lots of ways to fire them quickly, so we try to encourage behavior. We try to manage with strength, not by threats of firing, but by offering support, by offering help. We attempt to persuade individuals to make choices. We can't really force people to make choices. We encourage behavior in just a different way. We already talked about public scrutiny and oversight, but we actually have formal ways to be evaluated from external overseers. Now, in a private company, you may have an individual owner, you might have a family owner, you might have shareholders. Now they have responsibility for oversight, and you have to come in compliance with banking and finance rules. But really, I don't have, as a private individual, have the authority to go dig into the finances of GM or Ford or Hyundai. Like, I don't have that ability. But as a citizen, I can request a FOIA, a Freedom of Information Act request, for any public agency over more or less anything I want, and they're required to give me that information. That just blows the processes out of the water. Like, we have to behave totally different inside public organizations because we know that our books are open to everyone. In private organizations, you can have private memos. You can't have private memos in public organizations. All those memos become public documents. And so we have just different characteristic processes to ensure that we can be accountable to the oversight, to encourage our employees to behave differently, but we just simply don't function in the same way as private companies.